They didn't knock. They didn't call. They didn't warn me. One ordinary morning, I opened my mailbox and found a single envelope that shattered everything I thought I owned. Inside was a dry, legal notice stating my 4,000-acre farm had been transferred while I was still paying taxes on it. No meeting. No signature from me. Just a clean line saying the property now belonged to an HOA I'd barely heard of. My hands shook as I reread it, certain there had to be a mistake. But that paper was real, and so was the theft hiding behind polite legal language. That land wasn't just dirt and fences. It was my family's legacy. I'd watched the sun rise over those fields for years, walked the boundaries myself, fixed broken posts, argued with surveyors, and defended it from opportunists who smelled money in acreage numbers. 4,000 acres doesn't disappear quietly, yet somehow it had. Someone had moved carefully, silently, and with confidence they believed I'd never fight back. At first, I did exactly what they expected. I panicked. I called offices. I left voicemails. I begged for explanations. Every answer sounded rehearsed. They said the HOA had authority. They said notices were sent. They said I must have missed a deadline. Each sentence pushed responsibility back onto me, like I was careless enough to lose land worth millions by accident. That night, I couldn't sleep. Instead of replaying their words, I started reading. Old deeds. County filings. Zoning records. HOA bylaws so boring most people would quit after 2 pages. I wasn't looking for a miracle. I just wanted proof they were wrong. That's when I noticed something small, buried deep in legal text they assumed no one would ever read closely. The HOA had taken my farm using a shortcut. A technical move that only worked if the original owner stayed silent. It was legal, but fragile. And the more I read, the clearer it became, they'd rushed. They'd skipped a step. They'd relied on intimidation instead of precision. What they didn't know was that the same rule they used to take my land also exposed every single house they controlled. By sunrise, my fear was gone. In its place was focus. I stopped calling them. I stopped arguing. I prepared one document, one filing, one silent move of my own. No threats. No confrontation. Just patience. They thought the story was over. They had no idea it was only beginning. I waited 3 days before doing anything. Not because I was unsure, but because timing mattered. The HOA was celebrating. I could tell by the sudden activity around the neighborhood bordering my former land. New survey flags appeared. Trucks rolled in. Letters were sent to homeowners announcing expanded authority and updated jurisdiction. They were already acting like kings, carving territory they believed was permanently theirs. Confidence makes people sloppy, and sloppiness leaves records. Instead of calling a lawyer right away, I went to the county records office myself. Not the front desk, the back terminals where scanned documents live forever. I pulled the HOA's filing line by line. There it was, the transfer instrument they used to claim my farm. Perfectly formatted. Properly stamped. And quietly flawed. They'd invoked an emergency administrative clause meant for abandoned properties. The clause only worked if no beneficial owner had exercised rights within a defined period. Taxes, maintenance, access, disputes, all of those counted as exercise of rights. I had done all of them. Repeatedly. What made it worse for them was what came next. That same emergency clause required a follow-up validation filing within a narrow window. Miss it, and the transfer didn't just weaken, it inverted. Any assets governed under that authority became exposed to reversion claims. Not future claims. Immediate ones. The HOA had used the clause to grab my land, but in doing so, they'd placed every house they controlled under the same legal umbrella. I didn't confront them. I didn't send a warning letter. I filed a notice of procedural defect and attached certified proof of continuous land use. Then I filed a secondary motion quiet, precise, devastating invoking reversionary standing. It didn't accuse them of fraud. It didn't demand damages. It simply stated that due to improper authority execution, all properties managed under that declaration were now subject to corrective reassignment pending review. In plain language, it meant this: until a judge said otherwise, the HOA didn't own my farm and I temporarily held standing over every home they governed. The filings went through without resistance. Clerks don't argue when paperwork is clean. By the time the HOA realized something was wrong, the notices were already mailed. Homeowners opened letters they didn't understand. Banks froze transactions. Insurance companies flagged policies. And the HOA board? They went silent. That evening, my phone finally rang. A board member left a voicemail, calm but tight, asking for a discussion. I didn't call back. I knew what they were seeing on their screens. The same fear I'd felt days earlier, only now it was multiplied by hundreds of homes. They'd taken my land quietly. I was taking their power the same way. The next morning, the neighborhood felt different. Not louder. Not chaotic. Just tense, like everyone was holding their breath without knowing why. Homeowners stood in driveways longer than usual, phones pressed to ears, mail envelopes unfolded and refolded in nervous hands. The HOA board hadn't issued a statement. No emails. No emergency meeting notice. Silence is powerful, but only when you control it. This time, they didn't. By noon, the first mistake happened. An HOA attorney filed an objection too fast, too emotional. Instead of addressing the procedural defect, they argued intent. They claimed the transfer of my farm was lawful in spirit and that any technical errors were harmless. That argument might work in public debates. It collapses instantly in property law. Land doesn't care about intent. It only recognizes precision. That objection did something critical: it acknowledged the defect without curing it. The moment it was logged, the reversionary trigger solidified. My temporary standing over HOA managed properties converted into recognized interim authority. I didn't celebrate. I documented. I downloaded filings. I saved timestamps. Every minute mattered now. Then the calls started. Not from the board, from homeowners. Confused. Scared. Some angry. Others polite but desperate. They asked if their mortgages were safe. If their homes were at risk. If they'd done something wrong. I told them the truth, calmly and consistently. Their homes weren't being seized. Their lives weren't collapsing. The HOA had acted outside its authority, and the system was correcting itself. Panic fades quickly when someone speaks without fear. Behind the scenes, banks notice the flags. Lenders hate uncertainty. Several froze HOA-linked accounts until ownership questions were resolved. Vendors stopped work. Security contracts paused. The HOA's control, once absolute, started slipping through their fingers, not because I attacked it, but because it no longer had legal footing to stand on. Late that afternoon, a certified letter arrived at my door. The HOA proposed a mutual resolution. They offered to reverse the farm transfer quietly if I withdrew my filings. No apology. No admission. Just a reset, as if nothing had happened. That offer told me everything. They weren't confident. They were afraid of precedent. Afraid a judge would read the same bylaws I had and realize how many shortcuts had been taken over the years. I didn't respond. Instead, I filed one more document. A request for formal review. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't public. It simply asked the court to confirm what the paperwork already showed. That single filing extended the interim period and locked the HOA out of unilateral action. They'd expected me to beg. To negotiate from weakness. Instead, I let the process speak. And the process was very loud. The court didn't rush, but it didn't stall either. Within days, the formal review was accepted, and that acceptance alone shifted everything. The HOA could no longer pretend this was a clerical hiccup. Their authority was officially under examination. Notices went out again, this time stamped with language homeowners recognized as serious. Pending review. Interim control. Restricted authority. Words that make people stop scrolling and start asking questions. The board finally called an emergency meeting. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be. What mattered was what happened afterward. The minutes leaked. Arguments. Blame. Finger pointing. One board member insisted they'd followed the same process for years. Another argued that no one had ever challenged it before. That sentence told me more than any document could. This wasn't an accident. It was a habit. Meanwhile, homeowners organized their own meetings. Not protests, conversations. They compared letters. Compared timelines. Compared stories about fines, liens, and threats they'd accepted without question. Once authority cracks, memory returns. People start realizing how often they were told you have no choice. And how rarely that was actually true. I stayed quiet. I didn't post online. I didn't speak to reporters. Power shifts faster when it isn't announced. Behind the scenes, I worked with the court-appointed administrator, supplying records, maps, tax receipts, and proof of continuous use. Every document reinforced the same conclusion: the HOA had overreached, and my land had simply exposed it. Then came the turning point. A judge issued a narrow interim order. It didn't punish the HOA. It didn't reward me. It clarified authority. The emergency clause they'd used was suspended retroactively. That meant their claim over my farm collapsed completely. But more importantly, every enforcement action taken under that clause was now questionable. Overnight, the HOA lost its teeth. Fines paused. Liens froze. Foreclosure threats evaporated. Homeowners who'd lived under constant pressure suddenly had room to breathe. And all of it traced back to one silent move they thought no one would notice. The board requested mediation again. This time, the tone changed. They wanted boundaries. Limits. A way to preserve some control without admitting fault. I agreed to listen, not because I needed anything from them, but because the next step would define what this community became. They had taken my farm in secret. They had ruled through shortcuts. Now, the system was asking a simple question: who actually had the right to decide? Mediation took place in a plain room with no drama, no raised voices, and no audience. That was intentional. When power is real, it doesn't need performance. Across the table sat the HOA's representatives, their confidence replaced by careful wording and guarded expressions. They weren't there to argue law anymore. They were there to survive it. The mediator opened by asking what each side wanted. The HOA spoke first. They talked about stability, continuity, and protecting homeowners from uncertainty. It sounded noble, but it was hollow. They never mentioned how that uncertainty had been created. When it was my turn, I didn't speak about revenge or punishment. I spoke about structure. About rules applied evenly. About authority that comes from consent, not fear. I laid out the facts simply. The farm transfer was void. The emergency clause had been abused. Any authority derived from it couldn't stand. The HOA could either continue fighting and risk a full judicial review of every action taken under that clause, or they could accept a controlled unwinding. One path led to years of litigation and exposure. The other led to reform. Silence followed. Long silence. That's when I knew they understood. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about precedent. If a judge ruled broadly, the model they'd relied on wouldn't just break here, it would break everywhere. By the end of the session, the outline of an agreement emerged. The HOA would formally renounce the emergency authority permanently. All enforcement actions taken under it would be nullified. My farm would be restored with clear title, publicly recorded. In exchange, I would withdraw claims to extended standing over individual homes once the correction was complete. No fines repaid. No damages sought. Just correction and containment. But there was one condition I wouldn't bend on. Transparency. Every homeowner would be notified of what happened, in plain language. No spin. No legal fog. People deserve to know who governs them and how that power is used. They resisted that part. Hard. Transparency is dangerous to systems built on quiet compliance. But they had no leverage left. The mediator put it plainly, without agreement, the court would decide, and courts write opinions that live forever. 2 days later, the agreement was signed. The restoration of my farm happened quietly, just like its theft. A new deed recorded. Old flags removed. Trucks left. The land didn't cheer. It simply waited, patient as ever. But the neighborhood changed. HOA notices became softer. Meetings became open. People asked questions and expected answers. They had taken my farm believing silence meant weakness. They were wrong. Silence, used correctly, had undone everything they built on shortcuts. After the agreement, life didn't snap back to normal. It settled into something quieter, more deliberate. The farm returned to my name, but the experience had changed how I looked at ownership. Land isn't just controlled by fences and deeds. It's controlled by who reads, who questions, and who stays silent. For years, the HOA had relied on the assumption that no one would ever challenge the machinery behind the notices and fines. That assumption was gone now. The court-appointed administrator stayed in place for several months, overseeing the transition. HOA powers were rewritten line by line. Enforcement procedures required clear votes. Emergency clauses were narrowed so tightly they were almost unusable. Homeowners attended meetings they'd once ignored. Not because they suddenly loved governance, but because they understood the cost of apathy. I went back to walking the farm. Same paths. Same wind through the grass. But now, every boundary marker meant something deeper. I'd seen how easily paper could erase reality, and how easily reality could return when paper was forced to tell the truth. Neighbors from the HOA community began stopping by not to argue, but to talk. Some apologized. Others admitted they'd never questioned the board before. Fear keeps systems running long after legitimacy fades. One afternoon, I received a message from a different HOA in another county. Then another. Word had traveled quietly, the way these things do. They weren't asking for help. They were asking questions. About clauses. About authority. About how much of what they'd accepted was actually enforceable. I answered carefully. Not with instructions, but with encouragement to read, verify, and document. The original HOA tried to rebuild its image. New board members. New tone. Public promises. That was fine. Reform isn't about destruction. It's about correction. But the illusion of invincibility was gone forever. They knew now that silence could be broken, and that one careful challenge could ripple outward in ways no one could control. What stayed with me most wasn't the victory. It was the realization of how close I'd come to losing everything simply by assuming the system would protect me. It doesn't. Systems protect themselves. People protect themselves by paying attention. They had taken my farm in secret, believing complexity would hide them. One silent legal move had exposed not just their mistake, but their entire foundation. And once that foundation cracked, nothing built on shortcuts could stand for long. As months passed, the consequences of that single legal correction spread further than I expected. Not loudly, not publicly, but steadily. The HOA continued operating, but now every action moved slower, heavier, like someone walking on ice after it cracks once. Nothing was automatic anymore. Every notice was questioned. Every fine reviewed. Every decision debated. That friction wasn't a flaw, it was accountability taking root. Homeowners began forming committees independent of the board. Not rebellions, just safeguards. People who'd never read bylaws before were suddenly quoting them. They weren't trying to take power, they were making sure no one could quietly concentrate it again. Fear had once kept everyone obedient. Knowledge replaced it. I was invited to speak at one of those meetings. I almost declined. I didn't want to be a symbol. But I went, and I didn't talk about my farm at all. I talked about process. About how authority usually doesn't arrive with force, it arrives with paperwork, deadlines, and the assumption that no one will slow down long enough to challenge it. Heads nodded. People recognized themselves in that description. Someone asked why I didn't fight publicly. Why no lawsuits, no press, no confrontation? I told them the truth. Noise gives the other side time to prepare. Silence makes them reveal their habits. The HOA hadn't fallen because I attacked it. It stumbled because it kept walking as if no one was watching. That lesson stayed with the community. They stopped waiting for permission to ask questions. They started requesting records as a routine practice, not a hostile one. Transparency became normal, not threatening. Ironically, the HOA began functioning better under that pressure. Fewer abuses. Fewer shortcuts. Real governance, instead of automatic control. I returned fully to working the land. Crops don't care about legal battles. They respond to consistency. The farm recovered quickly, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I'd seen how fragile ownership can be when people assume it can't happen to me. That belief is the real vulnerability. Occasionally, I still receive letters from HOAs elsewhere. Some angry. Some cautious. Some quietly grateful. I don't engage in battles for them. I simply remind them of one thing: read what you're governed by. Silence isn't neutrality. It's permission. The HOA that took my land thought they were invisible behind procedures. They were wrong. Procedures are trails. Someone always follows them eventually. And when they do, shortcuts stand out like broken branches. They took my farm believing the story would end there. Instead, it became a reference point. A reminder that power borrowed without care eventually collapses under its own weight. The final review hearing came quietly, almost anticlimactic compared to everything that led up to it. No crowd. No headlines. Just a judge, a clean record, and a clear question: had the system corrected itself, or merely patched a mistake? By then, the answer was obvious. The paperwork told a different story than it would have months earlier. Clear authority. Proper limits. No shortcuts hiding in footnotes. The judge didn't lecture. Judges rarely do when the lesson is already written into the record. Instead, the court issued a narrow confirmation order. My farm title was affirmed beyond dispute. The HOA's revised authority was accepted, with permanent restrictions embedded into its governance. Most importantly, the emergency clause that started everything was rendered functionally unusable going forward. Not illegal, just harmless. A tool without teeth. For the homeowners, it meant closure. No more frozen accounts. No more uncertainty hanging over their deeds. For the HOA, it meant survival at a cost: humility. Power once exercised quietly now required visibility. Decisions required explanation. Silence was no longer enough. After the hearing, I walked out alone. No victory speech. No celebration. Outside, life moved on like it always does. Cars passed. People checked phones. The world didn't stop for justice. It rarely does. But justice doesn't need applause to matter. Back at the farm, I stood near the old fence line where survey flags had once marked someone else's claim. They were gone now. In their place was open land, unchanged and indifferent. Land has a way of outlasting every system built to control it. That realization grounded me more than any legal win. I thought about how easily this could have gone the other way. One missed detail. One assumption that they must be right. One decision to stay quiet out of exhaustion. The HOA hadn't won because they were smarter. They'd almost won because they counted on me giving up. That's the part people misunderstand. Systems like this don't rely on strength. They rely on fatigue. On the belief that fighting back costs more than surrender. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it isn't. The difference is knowing when silence protects you and when it empowers someone else. I didn't take every HOA house in the end. I didn't need to. The temporary standing was enough to force correction. Ownership returned to where it belonged. Authority was cut down to size. That was the real outcome. They had taken my farm in secret, believing no one would follow the trail. One silent legal move had been enough to expose everything. Not through force. Not through noise. Just by refusing to look away. In the months that followed, the story faded from conversation, and that was exactly how it should end. Real change doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly, reshaping behavior long after attention moves elsewhere. The HOA continued operating under its new limits. Homeowners stayed engaged. And my farm returned to being what it had always been: land that demanded work, patience, and respect, not vigilance against paperwork. People sometimes ask if I'd do it differently knowing what I know now. If I'd act sooner. Louder. More aggressively. The answer surprises them. I wouldn't change the silence. Silence forced the truth into the open. It allowed habits to reveal themselves. It gave the system enough rope to show exactly how it functioned when it thought no one was watching. The real lesson wasn't about HOAs or land transfers. It was about attention. About how often people surrender control not because they're wrong, but because they're tired. Systems built on complexity thrive on that exhaustion. They don't need to be perfect. They just need you to stop reading. My farm didn't survive because I was powerful. It survived because I stayed curious when fear would have been easier. Because I read when I could have argued. Because I waited when I could have reacted. One careful move, placed at the right time, had more impact than any public fight ever could. I still walk the boundaries some mornings. Not out of paranoia, but appreciation. Each marker reminds me that ownership isn't passive. Neither is freedom. Both require participation, even when it's inconvenient, even when the process feels deliberately confusing. Occasionally, I hear about other disputes. Other quiet corrections. Other people who decided to read instead of resign. I don't take credit for those. But I recognize the pattern. Once someone proves the machinery can be questioned, others realize it was never untouchable to begin with. The HOA that took my farm believed they were invisible behind procedure. They believed silence meant consent. They believed no one would notice one small clause buried deep enough. They were wrong on all counts. Procedures leave trails. Silence can be strategic. And one person paying attention is enough to change the direction of an entire system. In the end, I didn't seize every house. I seized something far more important: the truth of how power was being used. And once that truth was exposed, the rest corrected itself. The farm stands. The homes stand. And the lesson remains: when something is taken quietly, it can be reclaimed the same way. Not with noise. Not with force. But with focus.